Thank you. Thank you. We are going to get started with our readings. I'm just removing all of the pins so we can see all the books reading. So our first featured poet for tonight is Ashia Ajani. Ashia is a sun shower, a glass bead, an overripe nectarine, hailing from Denver, Colorado, Queen City of the Plains, in the unceded territory of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho peoples. Ajani currently resides in Oakland, California, unceded Ohlone land, where they work as a climate-resilient schools educator. Their book, Heirloom, was a 2022 recipient of the Write Bloody Publishing Jack McCarthy Prize. Their writing is a kaleidoscope of their work as an abolitionist and eco-griot. We are also going to put the footnote link for Ashia if you want to support their work that way as well. But we are very excited to have Ashia join us. Ashia Ajani.
Thank you so much for that introduction, CD. It's very wonderful to be back here at Open Mouth. I really love all the work that y'all do, making poetry and performance as accessible to everyone who's interested as possible. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Destiny later and to hear her read as well. I have a few poems from my collection, Heirloom, for y'all. Thank you all for putting the links in the chat. Yeah, I'll go ahead and get into it. This first poem is called Collards. The pot stays on. On the stove, the simmer sojourns south. Hunger don't have no place in this kitchen. In this kitchen, every black belly has its feed. This ornamental garden tastes best after the first frost, after what could not survive falls to decay in service of more sumptuous fruit. Oh, my clever, sour god smoked from brine and whimsy. Sweet water recalls me a Mississippi madwoman, sick to the soul with all of this fruit, yearning for what it means to feed and be fed. So one of the reasons that I chose this poem and the other poems that I'm going to be reading is because I was very much inspired by Mother World. And especially because as a climate resilience organizer and an educator, I feel like I read a lot of just like really negative content about the environment, about the state of the world. And it's also really important for me and for us, you know, as community members, to access the joy and the relationship that we have to Earth. And so I was really inspired by a lot of the poems from Mother World about, you know, reaching towards both our inheritance, but also, you know, the kind of futures that we are calling into existence. So this next poem is a little bit more about inheritance and migration. And it's called 9 Indian Fruit Oil Money House Blessing. And if folks aren't familiar with what the fruit oil money house blessing is, it's oftentimes used in hoodoo, you know, Santeria, in other kind of like diasporic Afro-Indigenous religions, as kind of like a way to call back to these kind of like ancestral fruits and nuts and oils that we would use, but they come in like a really weird purple can that you just kind of spray around the room, and you can find them at Botanicas, but you can also find it at Walmart too. So the epigraph for this poem is, Anansi admirers will probably reply that in order to cope with an unstraight and crooked world, one needs unstraight and crooked paths. Rex Nettleford. 1. The dead harmonize. Invocations of one bring many, each tongue a split cipher. Scent stuck to southern summer steam, 9 fruits, Virginia Slims, cat food Folgers, propane, plastic wrapped furniture, old cognac, nail polish, body heat, the dead red of summer. Ceiling fan blowing the same hot air around in circles. Disclaimer, curio only. 222. The Lord gonna bless me today. My bones look better at the end of the world cut off from flesh. A headless ghost or only a head severed from ancestral body. obscure enough to let most anything and everything in, clear as dishwater. Don't we all just look the same? Oh, don't you know, we got a little bit of everything in us. Can you use some creative license? Those memories are best kept in a lockbox on the vanity. 3. Anansi learned to shapeshift by watching distorted tides of the Atlantic, his long body salt stained, trickster shorn skin, hatched together bloodline remnants for new regalia. Fragrance always signals a return, massages memory. Roots stretching east, both planted and displanted. Fruit from nowhere and everywhere at once. 4. When a culture is preserved, is it pickled? Is it smoked, frozen, vacuum sealed? Does it lose its sazon in an effort to prevent spoilage? Does savagery stay put or just evolve with the times? Does the scent of God linger on our fingertips still? 5. Agua, propelente, fragancia, estabilizadores, conservadores. Collapsed fruit stuck to dehydrated lineages. What remains is diffusion. 6. Dispersed carcinogens intermingling. Breath is a necessary sacrifice to be had for a small blessing. Golden ghastly spray. Borrowed time anyways. 7. Mist modified for survival. The story changes every seaport, canning culture. Umbilical cords buried under provision grounds. If we can't source, we invent. If we can't invent, we release to the breeze time after time. 8. There remains a fine line between enlightenment and entertainment. We anointed our walls with the dead matter behind our gums, eyes plugged flush dark by a landlord who says he can only be responsible to what he sees. 9. I disagree. In her final years, my great-mother's world didn't extend beyond her porch. Her eyesight wanes. She has seen enough. Incense smoke carries her blossoms eastward. All right. This next poem is probably one of my favorite poems in the collection. And it's called Life Cycle. Whoa, that was a really big spider. Look, I was speaking about Anansi and the spider just came up on my wall. That's power of words. All right, Life Cycle. America is a factory. My father built security cameras from discarded junk phones, their cracked screens, a subterranean stained glass, burgeoning blessings. Come one, come all if you dare. He welds a fine line between surveillance and security. My father is no stranger to a gun. My father believes in a self-proclaimed rapture. The hills have eyes. My father's lenses thicken as his vision defers. At the end of the world, he hopes to patent his despair. America is a landfill. Underwater, bloodline brined, it's soured. My neighbor pours the leftover liquid from a pot of greens into his garden. Billowing green stink arises, stains room for ripening. Black folks despise waste. The last drops of Crown Peach in the dog's water bowl for taste. The plastic bags under my auntie's kitchen cabinet, exceptional cushioning for our endangered shadows. Never afforded the softness of packing peanuts. Is the soul biodegradable? Can it be upcycled? At least we still have Granny's house. Wrap your apparitions in polyester coves, send them out to ocean. May they forever exist in sedimentary purgatory floating on. In this sense, we never rest. In this sense, pollution profits. And won't these white folks come and pick up the damn crash? America is a false idol, all my people iconoclast. Look out the window at all that. Goddamn, what is he protecting? Ain't nothing here ours but scraps of metal melted all down, why don't you? Some homes are worth less than their copper pipes, this metallic stew pot boiling over. My ancestors bartered their gold teeth for green, earned heart disease and curdled cream dreams instead, as the planet warms another degree. Mama says my degree won't save me. Suppose cash really does rule everything around me. I wonder, what rich bones can broth a new vanguard? Can a nigga get a witness? America is a malignant tumor. Oh, how I long to capitalize this intrusion in our collective heartbeat, beating away at the floorboards of good sense until spirits rattle around pushing daisies, memory stinging nettle unsilenced. Watch the good earth reclaim clunkers for cash. Nostalgia makes a mockery of present. The open-faced sores on my uncle's knuckles a tribute to this nation's success. I won't bullshit you. He reeks of burnt sienna and ember. It all reeks of pyrated pyrite, fool's gold. I talk too much about my grandmother's hands because they threshed this country. Great migration granny, built Ford tough, a gorgeous ghost gnarled into graphics. Look closely. You can see flakes of calluses soldered to your car's lithium battery. I talk too much about my grandmother's hands because they became cracked by bleach, ammonia, everything meant to whiten and purge bacteria. She passed down her genealogy of anguish, lead-hardened blood, black lung coughing up embattled blues. Wasn't the Tin Man once chopping through scorched earth too? My gut is filled with vengeful microorganisms. Today and every day beyond grief, I throw my grease against any surface in need of shine. America, define yourself a country exactly. My offering, a knotted bellyache of sadness born beyond a destined horizon, manifested. The embers of our lost selves tumbling across the West Coast. Even the mountains seemed to collapse with sadness. The spine of the uninherited earth curved like that of a funeral wailer, an assembly line aggravating access, all that rust corroding our good sense. Riddle me this, how can I be well when my lawn is always burning? All right, I think I'm gonna read one more. I know that I submitted two more. One of the ones I think Destiny and I are gonna discuss, so there'll be a little like a little nod to that. It's called Groundwater Gods, and it's about pill bugs, roly-polies, some of my favorite insects. But this one that I'm going to read to close out is Blackest Blue. And throughout the collection, I'm really fascinated by ancestry, and then, but of course, like the ways in which that we are connected to non-human species. And so there was a recent discovery, I think it was probably 2018, 2019. They discovered a couple classes of fish, deep sea fish, that have melanin. And one of them is called the Pacific black dragon. And of course, in my diasporic brain, started thinking about all the different possibilities of kinship there. So this is a poem about the Pacific black dragon. Imagine, beyond the crest of some sailboat sunk into depth, fish kin of perpetic proportions, gloat gleeful praise of ships saddled to sand. Yes, godless, rolling in the prestige of camouflage, the sheen of soulful medicine that glistens in fins too dark in depth to hold any light body. My mother talks to fish. She sings to them, open-mouthed and gully-lipped, observes their slender, enciphered movements, dares to make fantasy about their splendid magic. She is no stranger to making stealth survival. This bitter marinage, burden bliss of exile, the ocean floor remembers every bone and nail that pried freedom from a rotted floorboard. Monsters made sacred live down here. In satisfaction, its magnificent depths unearthed, inundated in bejeweled splendor, recall the eulogized pleas for deliverance back eastward. These new bodies make room for a rebirth migration built of desire, not demand. These spirits flitter between planes of scale and skin, souls tethered in a shared sense of melanin. At last, deep sea cosmologies. Mother says, let them breathe. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to hear Destiny read now.
Thank you so much for reading all of these incredible poems, Ashia. The way that you're so masterfully able to move between these massive concepts and then just these really specific, beautiful images is just awesome. There's so many lines in here where you just focus in on the scales of the fish and also what it means. And we're just left thinking about all the different ways that image gains so much meaning. Thank you so much for being here and reading with us. Our next featured reader is Destiny Hemphill. Just going to read their bio. Destiny Hemphill is a chronically ill poet and ritual worker living on the land of the Ino Okanichi band of the Saponi Nation, a recipient of fellowships from Naropa University's summer writing program, Tin House, Kenyan Review Writers Workshop, Callaloo, and Open Mouth Writing Retreat. She is the author of the chapbook Oracle, A Cosmology from Honeysuckle Press. They're also the author of Mother World, a devotional for the altar life from Action Books. Very excited to have Destiny with us. Destiny Hemphill.
Thank you. Thanks so much, CD and Antler, and it's so good to be back at Open Mouth, and it was so great, Ashia, to hear your words and your voice, and to feel the actual resonance and vibration. I've spent a lot of time with them the past few weeks, so yeah, there was a lot of warmth that I felt in my heart and in my belly, just like getting to, experience them wash over me in your voice. And also, thank you all for being here with us tonight. And special shout out to Joy, who, there's not really words in terms of like how important she is, period, but like also how much she's made Mother World possible from our time back in our MFA program. Okay, so I'm going to read a few poems, and then I'm excited to talk to Ashia more. The first poem I'm going to read is called Apocalypse, so song number 3, and it will serve as my ancestral dedication for tonight. Apocalypse, so song number 3. Mama say, take this calendula, it's for the heart. Mama say, don't be like Grandma Mabel, don't swallow anger down and have it rupture and stroke. Mama say, this is no time for seduction by nostalgia. Say, you better open your mouth. Open your mouth and speak, girl. Mama say, teach your lungs to inhale and exhale serpentine. Mama say, make your breath do a silent dance to a secret song. Mama say, you got lamentation on you. Mama say, therefore we chose you. Mama say, you better open your mouth and call out. Let the worms, the bitter rot, trapped and bruised in your throat fall out. Mama say, take this hawthorn, eventide. It's for your heart. Mama say, chew on this little bit of clay. Mama say, taste the intimacy of this world's unmaking. Mama say, be like your Grandma Mabel, who after starving as a child declared she'd conjure feast for every child she did meet. Baby, you better feast. Mama say, roll your head back, cackle, crackle, show each of your teeth. Mama say, take this honeysuckle, it's for your heart. You got lamentation on you. Mama say, therefore we choose you. Mama say, this earth will outlive this world. Mama say again, this earth will outlive this world. So the next poem I'm going to read is, we asked Mama and them, why do you study astrology? And this poem emerged out of a meditation because I'm an astrology enthusiast, and also chronically dissociate. So I was thinking, trying to be present more to this experience on Earth, and also the political demands of being an Earthling, and thinking about where it's like Fred Modens, who says that, and this isn't verbatim, but paraphrase, that like the imperative of Black studies is to save the Earth. And so instead of, escaping the Earth or transcending it or leaving it behind, how was I to remain rooted, while also really attentive to the ether, the cosmos, and everything beyond. We asked Mama and them, why do you study astrology and oracle reading? Before I was here, I was there, you see, elsewhere, glittering in my refusal to be enshrined in flesh. And once I was even a moon, withholding my countenance from planets unworthy of facing me. I mean, they couldn't even faze me. I have many lives cracked from and scattered across the cosmos. I hear them echoing through the ether. I'm just trying to echo back. I mean, haven't you yearned for another language? Searched for another language because the first one you were forced to learn cannot name everything you need to decipher, twinkling glyphs signed across your flesh. Do you follow me? It's not that I study the stars, but I listen for the night to speak, and it's always speaking. Consider moonbeams riddling the water of your body, Venus and Jupiter dancing in trine as though intertwined upon your arrival. Consider you knowing what it is to seek refuge in retrograde, the tender shadows of your own casting, of your own body that others call terrifying. Consider the generosity of some star gesturing towards another star, guiding fugitive earthlings and furtive escapes towards freedoms. Consider Harriet gazing at those same constellations, or spilling possibilities of holding without possession. Consider you knowing what it is to collapse after offering radiance. Consider Turner turning to the sky and reading planets' revolutions as signal to turn, to prepare for our own. Consider you knowing what it is to charge forth, accumulating in collision. Consider eclipse, that ring of fire with blackness at its center. Consider how our conspiracies might configure. Consider us as testaments of the cosmic and telluric. Consider an invitation meaning to go with your star. Consider the cosmic and the telluric as our accomplice and witness. And then the next two poems, it's like a mini sequence, a dyad of sorts. And the first one's called Crown Shyness, or Breathing Practice. And it's thinking about the phenomenon of, canopies of trees and little spaces in between that you can see. And, there's been many theories. Scientists initially thought of that as more of a competitive move of the trees vying with each other for air and sunlight. But more recently, scientists have been thinking about it being more collaborative in terms of making sure that there's enough space for everyone in the canopy to receive air and light. And so I was thinking about that as a model of relation. And the epigraph for this one is from Ashia Crawley: a desire for otherwise air than what is and what has been given. In this together dream, we are in the forest again, lying down, our crowns almost touch, but not quite, forming a circle like the pistil of a flower, our trunks and limbs the petals. We are here to practice other ways of breathing, other ways of being with each other. In this together dream, some of us bristle with sharp intakes of breath when we see the limbs of the trees and reach for our necks. And the trees, they seem to feel our hands near the roots and bend back with the wind too. All of us petrified with memory of being uprooted, cut down. All of us knowing violence. But what else do the prophet mothers say we know? Oh yes, we know care too. We let go of our breath. Don't try to hold it captive. Trust it will come back. We know care. Yes, yes, hiding in the hollows of trees from captors. We know care. Yes, yes, watering the roots. We know care, taking in each other's breath, yes, because we need each other's breath to breathe. Remembering how we found ways to be with each other beyond the ways we've been forced to. And then its pair is we're in the forest breathing again. And as we continue to breathe, we notice overhead the hushed adornment of branches against the firmament, the crowns of trees creeping close, so close that they may gently touch, but blossoms blush just enough, won't allow their limbs to brush each other. This desire to be close, rooted to honoring spaces needed for growth. How becoming is this becoming? Haloed branch furtively unfurls alongside haloed branch, enshrines the hollows as hallowed, unveils the solemn amber glow of above unto the wine-colored undergrowth. So the stars can wink below at dirt, fungi, larvae, stones, and feathers. And yes, the fugitive too. May we know how to reach and reach for each other, if only to get just close enough to breathe and breathe with each other. Just be with one another, yes. And then this final one is more alive than when you began, a ritual. And yeah, throughout Mother World, I'm thinking of the end of this world as a requirement. If we have any hope for creating life-sustaining ways of relating to each other, and particularly sustaining Black life, knowing that this world was created around coloniality and anti-Blackness. And at the same time, the end of this world is only the end of a world. So that, yeah, this world isn't the totalizing sum of how we can be with each other. More alive than when you began. In the now times, we plant red spider lilies along the borders, the same borders that we insist never had to exist. We do this in preparation for the world to end. This world that has been carved from what's been extracted from us. This world held up by the gleaming bones of those who came before us. Afterwards, we pause. We can feel at our fingertips glimmers of worlds to be, of worlds becoming. They surround us, flickering about like fireflies that can't be caught in jars and placed atop windowsills because we know that no being should be held captive. So we keep living and we keep laughing on the porches of our homes made of palm and ash, keep singing, our throats lush, gushing with memory of honey and salt, dancing and spinning with the lightning bugs, picking up red dust. Look at how it coats our shins and calves, rests on our chest and mingles with sweat, and then there, an orange or yellow or green bulb flits across your skin. Your whole mouth awes into an O as it glows and goes. Just that touch, just that brush of an emergent world, leaving you a little more lit, a little more alive than when you began. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much for sharing these with us. They're just absolutely gorgeous. One thing I just can't help but find through all of these is just the way that you make touch and like possibility through touch and texture just so beautiful. Just in that last poem, we can feel at our fingertips glimmers of worlds to be, of worlds becoming. It's just such a gorgeous image. Yeah, as Sophia said in the chat, we are under your spell, and that is 100% true. Thank you for reading, please.
Thank you.
Yeah. And with that, going to go into our discussion between y'all. So let y'all take that away.
Yay.
Cool. Yeah. Destiny, how do you want to kind of bounce back and forth? Like one of us asks a question, the other one asks a question. Do you want to, yeah, how do you want to do this?
Yeah, bouncing back and forth feels good. And I think I may have loaded too many questions. So totally cool with only getting through a couple of them because the work is juicy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel if you're cool with it, I can go ahead and ask you a question first.
Yeah.
So Mother World probably is like one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year. I think in a lot of ways, I don't hope isn't the right word, but like I think it has made me think a lot more deeper about my own like creative practice, not just my creative practice, but like my job and like some of the things that we are um passing down to youth. And one thing that I've noticed, especially with a lot of the youth that I work with, is a lot of them are really tired.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them are really, it's kind of hard to, it's very much like kind of like what is the point, you know, for a lot of young people. um but then, you know, we get outside and like they're putting their hands in the dirt or they're like learning new things, and it feels like a mix of like a break from all of the nonsense that's going on in their lives, but also like almost a direct practice of healing. um and so I just wanted to share that because as I was reading this book, I was just kind of thinking a lot about that. And I was also thinking too, I would love to know more about your background as a creative person, about how this collection came into being. What was it like structuring, you know, choosing poems? One of the things that I love about this collection is how like circular and how connective it is. I love, you know, kind of the expanding of the portal. Um, and I think about that too, you know, in relation to the young people that I work with. How are we, you know, expanding that portal for them?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, when you were talking about the youth that you work with, and the weariness that they feel, I really resonated with that. And Mother World comes out of deep weariness. So when I began penning Mother World back in 2017, um, yeah, I felt like I was just kind of like bent over, like gasping for breath. And so I was part of a really beautiful coalition of community organizers in Durham. And um, that experience of community organizing from about 2013 to 2017 made me feel like so much was possible and enlivened me so much. And, you know, towards the end of 2016, really the middle of 2016, even before the change in regime of our settler colony, um, people were splintering, you know, people were literally being taken out. I think that's something that we don't talk a lot about, that like, you know, organizers were really disappeared. And then organizers who survived, um, not having their material needs met, and then just the interpersonal dynamics and trauma that happens when you're trying to do something new, but you're bringing your whole personal history and collective history to the cauldron. And so I felt a lot of despair, and Mother World became a devotional of sorts for me to remain faithful to the idea that, yeah, we can transform these conditions. At the same time, we were hearing so many people speaking in the language of apocalypse, and that also increased the feeling of despair for me. But then, you know, I was studying particularly Afro-pessimism, and it's like the injunction that the world does really have to end, and like that actually being also a refrain in so many Negro spirituals, like this world ain't my home, like, yeah, that my life, the fullest possibilities of my life is actually contingent upon the world ending, which is not the same thing though as the earth. And so that was also something that I was really dwelling with, because I was feeling a lot of grief about climate catastrophe, and a lot of hopelessness just because of the way that climate catastrophe is individualized. That's like a set of that oftentimes in popular discourse, not people who are like deep in the dirt, doing the work day to day, but like popular discourse is like, oh, like if you stop using straws, which is like a basic accessibility tool, but if you stopped using, plastic straws and you wore vegan leather, which is actually really plastic, things will be better, and yeah, I was just feeling a lot of grief, and also like understanding that the fate of this earth, and the way that it's been extracted from is absolutely intertwined with the condition of Black people, like through chattel slavery and its afterlives. So that's where it came out of. And then in terms of the actual creation, so like obviously I was doing a lot of reading and thinking, but my mom's a minister. I grew up in the Black church, so there's also like prayer as a compositional strategy. There's also ancestral offerings as a compositional strategy. There's dreams and divination and tarot that went into the book, as well as listening to music. And so then when I began actually organizing it, at a conceptual level, I wanted to depart from like it feeling linear, but also I wanted to be true to the experience of the way that it came through. Divination isn't linear, dreams aren't linear. And so I began organizing it really according to a rhythm. And so Mother World has a very wide associative web, but if you can catch the rhythm, like you can stay in the groove of it. Yeah, that took longer than I wanted, but
no, thank you for all of that. It's just like, it's so beautiful to kind of map process. And then I think especially as authors, or at least people who aren't really like familiar with like creative processes, it's really great to hear just like what all goes into the creation of a collection. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you. And so I think where I want to begin is with the Black ecological knowing, and unknowing that I feel like Heirlooms invites us into. And so you mentioned groundwater gods, so I want to be sure that we touch on groundwater gods. So for those who haven't read the collection yet, in that poem, there's a speaker who is spending time with pill bugs, or quote unquote miniature archivist. And the speaker says, I wanted to inhabit a shadowed underbelly too, eager to find solace in the veil of existence. Instead, they guarded their wisdom, curled up into an armored wall at the first show of sun, which immediately took me back to playing with roly-polies as a kid. And my brother had pet roly-polies that he was devastated when they dried up in the sun. But yeah, so it took me back to that moment. And so when I was reading this, it felt like this moment was encapsulating a Black ecological way of knowing, in the way that it bows to unknowing. And so the speaker has curiosity and reverence for the pill bug, and yet it's not completely transparent, which I feel like is a tendency, particularly in white feminist ecological text, where there's a lot of projection onto the more than human in terms of like imagining complete access to their world. But that doesn't happen here. And the pill book isn't available for the speaker to just extract from in pursuit of what they can learn from non-human life. And so I was wondering, could you talk more about Black ecological knowing and unknowing and how those intertwined practices make space to honor life in all of its forms?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And also, every time I read this poem, and also when I hear this question, I'm returned to like overturning rocks and like poking at bugs, because that's a lot of what I did when I was a kid. Because I was an only child, so I like entertained myself. So a lot of the ways that I entertained myself was to turn over rocks and poke bugs. And I think also just part of me comes from like two schools of thought. One, like a very cool like mythologically based, like I'm very like really interested in like a lot of Afro-diasporic mythologies, but I'm also really interested in kind of like the like pure like the more kind of like westernized like ecological science of roly-polies and pill bugs. And I'm fascinated by the fact that they are like heavy metal filters. And so they like keep like heavy metals in their gut and they filter it out of soil. And that's why a lot of times when people talk about having like pill bugs or like millipede like infestations, they're just kind of doing what they're naturally drawn to do. And when I was writing this poem, I was thinking about all of the different ways in which I wanted to have like a clear answer, and all the ways that we want to have clear answers about like, well, is what's going to happen the next day? Or like, am I going to like be able to get this? Or is my mom going to survive that? And I think one thing that I was thinking of as I was writing that poem in particular was like, there's like no clear way that we're going to have that understanding. Like you can't just like force the knowing. And sometimes you just have to let things do what they do. You can be curious and you can be engaged and you can be inquisitive. But at some point, like there is a limit to what you have access to. And you've got to be okay with that. I was thinking about that also in terms of how, especially in Indigenous communities and Afro-Indigenous communities, and also just, you know, like Black displaced communities, so much of our knowing is appropriated and taken. And when we're like too willing and too giving with like the magic or the knowledge that we have, then it's kind of like used in ways that we don't have access to. So I was talking actually to like an Indigenous elder the other day, and he is really lamenting the fact that like traditional ecological knowledge has become such a huge like talking point, especially in like IPCC and all of these other climate conferences, because Indigenous people aren't like reaping the benefits of that. What people are saying, and this, you know, the EPA is doing, is saying we need to like, you know, use like traditional ecological methods to like rehab this land. But Indigenous people aren't getting paid to rehab that land. They're just, the knowledge is just being taken and then applied. And so I was thinking about like, as I was writing this poem, I was thinking about these things. I was thinking about how you can like see, it's almost, I don't know like what to call it, but it's like when you go to a neighborhood and you see murals of Black folks, but there are no Black folks in living in the actual neighborhood. And so I wanted to kind of have this as almost like a spell or like an invocation of like, it's okay if you don't know that something's working. And some things you just don't need to have immediate access to that knowledge to, and you don't need to see that immediate knowledge to know that it's working.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I had no clue about roly-polies being heavy metal filters, but that is so cool, especially because their body does look like armor. And yeah, and thank you also for sharing what your elder was saying too, because yeah, I feel like even that encapsulates that that fraught relationship between certainty and uncertainty, where like these governmental structures, what they're banking on as certain is the continuation of the US as a settler colony, and wanting to use Indigenous knowledge to continue that. But if we do take seriously that the way to repair the earth, repair our relationships with the earth is already in this array of Indigenous knowledges globally, then we also have to really take seriously that that does not simply just having governmental agencies do it. That would actually require the rematriation of land too, which is like a very uncertain thing, right? Like that's a thing that people like have a hard time imagining. And so, yeah, I love that that was part of kind of like the root system of the poem. And I feel like that's also really underscored in the language of underbelly, like the underbelly of the roly-poly, the underbelly of knowledges, the underbelly of our world. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Destiny. CD, do we have time for one more question?
Definitely, yes.
All right, cool. Thinking about knowing, unknowing, also knowledge that's kind of gained, transpired, transmuted through so many different times and spaces. If folks haven't read it already, which like you need to read this book is so good. If you haven't read Mother World already, there's like a lot of references to Black musical and literary ancestors, also like ecological ancestors. And I love reading this collection because there'll be times where like I kind of like directly quote, or it's like after, it's like in the epigraph, but there'll be times where like I can read the text and I'm like, oh, that reminds me of blank, or like I see like that you're speaking with this person. And that's so beautiful because I think in a lot of ways, it shows how deeply connected we are, and how we're always kind of like speaking to each other through time and space. And so I was wondering if you could speak about this process of what I like to call co-creating with Black thought throughout the years, and how you're bringing these conversations across time and space onto the page. That's a long question for like 4 more, but I would love to see, would love to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah, it'll be a real Mariah Carey moment, one of the best with what I got. So we'll see. But yeah, so in Mother World, I feel like, yeah, it's very musical. There's a lot of cadences. I don't sing. I wish I could very deeply. My father can. But everybody was like, oh, did any of your children get Kevin's voice? And my parents were like, no, they did it, like just really clowning us. But I felt that all of the different types of Black musics, like blues, gospel, samba, there's also this, Sodaje from like Cape Verde. Like I feel like all of that is like percolates in my body and like comes out in the way that feels good for me to make language. And I think something that is very critical as like as a value of Black creative practice is collaboration and is co-creating. And so like I'm thinking about even like being in church where it's like you have to do something in order to prepare space for spirit to come. So it's like if you can't sing, you need to stomp your feet, you need to play the tambourine, you need to clap your hands, you need to do something to prepare space for spirit. Or thinking about whether it's like the Bataria in West African dance, or the Bate and Bomba, where it's like, it's a circle and you come in and you co-create with each other. And I think that Mother World also participates in like, in that lineage and history, and then even in like the idea of sampling, which like in The Last Angel of History, that documentary, or maybe it's The Last Angel of the Future. It's like a play on Walter Benjamin's essay. But in that documentary, it talks about sampling as an Afrofuturist technology because it becomes a time capsule. And so like, you know, Biggie's Juicy, like sampling Juicy by Ntume is like a time capsule. So it's like, and it's like that Sankofa movement where both looking back and, you know, feet forward. And I feel like I was really interested in replicating that movement like over and over and over again. And that the way that I hope that Mother World reaches hands in the future, reaches hearts in the future, is that like when they read it and they see all of these different references, that becomes its own sort of archive to nest with. That's not like a traditional or conventional archive, but as another way of sifting through all of the collaborators that make any of us possible at any given moment. Because even though it's a monograph, like, it's not just me, it's never just any one of us either. And so, yeah, that was a way to like visibilize that conviction that it's never just any one of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Destiny. This conversation, I wish that we could, I have so many more questions. And I just really cherish the wisdom that you pass on and the ways of knowing that you kind of make possible. And also just things I think I had like in the back of my head, you give such beautiful language to. So I appreciate you kind of like doing that, again, like that work on the page that is, calling all of these different people into existence, but also coming from a place of deep admiration, which is really cool. And it's like really awesome to see and to also hear you, speak about it too. I think I'll pass it over to CD, but I don't know what our time looks like.
Yeah, I just wanted to open it up for like questions for a little bit if folks had any, just because y'all have touched on so many important and powerful topics. If anyone has questions on any of that or wants to discuss anything further, just leave that open for a bit, put them in the chat. You can unmute yourself, whatever works. Because as some folks mentioned, a podcast would be incredible. That would be, hearing y'all talk about these concepts and hearing about, how the book came into being is always super fascinating to see. So that seeing that journey for Mother World is really insightful. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
I could jump in with a question while we wait for folks, unless anybody else wants to jump in. I would just love to hear more about your each of your creative processes. And you've spoken a little bit toward it, but what does writing a poem look like for each of you? And do you find that it is beneficial, because you both write a lot about nature, to do any of that writing out in nature? How does that sort of look like for each of y'all?
You want to begin, Ashia?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's very different, and it really does depend on the poem. When I was working on Heirloom, it started off as a different name. I can't even remember the name at this point. It started off as a little mini chapbook. And it was kind of just, I was grieving a lot. I was because my grandmother was such an important figure in my life, in my early life. And I just wanted to really kind of just write to remember. But as I was writing and, as I was also speaking and hanging out with some other family members. I think you reach like a certain point, like when you get a little bit older, that like your family members are a little bit more comfortable sharing a little bit like more of their lives with you, which was really like such a blessing. But it was also, I also learned a lot of stuff that a lot of things that they went through, that like I knew very like vaguely that they went through, but to hear, you know, from their mouths, and for them to like really kind of talk about, like my mom grew up during the there are a lot of Detroit riots, but my mom grew up during like the Detroit riots, and she like talks about how they used to just basically like sleep in the car in case that they ever had to like leave because like racial tensions were so bad. And then you know, my grandma just like telling me stories about like hitchhiking all the way from Mississippi to Detroit during the Great Migration. And so these are like things that, you know, kind of like in theory when you're a kid, because that is in a lot of ways, that is like my inheritance. That's a lot of Black folks' inheritance, knowing these stories, but then you hear them kind of like really like in depth and in detail. And so the manuscript like changed a lot, because as I was thinking about this, I was also like finishing up my degree in environmental studies. And of course I went to a PWI, and I'm like, wow, we're not talking about any of this in conversation with like the environmental impacts that migration and specifically forced migration has. Not talking about any of that. Especially at PWIs, they love to blame, like, you know, car industry, they love to blame this industry and that industry. And of course, you know, like a lot of these industries, you know, like do deserve that. But who are the people who are like in the factories, who are getting the burns, who are getting cancer, who are doing this because they have to, not because they want to? That's not part of the conversation. And so I really wanted to like sort of complicate this idea of environmentalism. I wanted to kind of like move away from this very Eurocentric view of like, what does it mean to be an environmentalist? What does it mean to want to see your family survive after all of this? And then also, you know, like per the title, like, what is my inheritance? What inheritance am I passing on to like future generations? And so like through mapping this migration, most of my mom's family is from Betonia, Mississippi, and then, you know, moving up through Detroit. And then my mom eventually, there was a lot of people don't know this, there was a big wave of middle-class Black folks moving out to Denver in the 70s, 90s. There was a big boom. And so my mom was part of that migration. And then me moving to California, it's just like, it felt like in so many ways, so many of me and my family members were just kind of constantly running. And then what was like kind of like the cultural loss that happened, what was the ecological loss, but also what were like some ways of like resilience and ability gained through that. And so I kind of like, even though that's like the major theme, whenever I like there's like a little bit of a departure when I'm talking about like, you know, Pacific Black Dragon, or I'm talking about groundwater gods, I'm constantly thinking about like, you know, like what is that like Black ecological knowing, and what is that like inheritance that's laid bare. In terms of writing, I think that honestly, this is going to sound so corny, but I think one of the most powerful tools, at least for me, is just like the power of observation. I just love to like go outside and walk and just kind of like see, and then I see how like a lot of different things are connected. So right now I live in an area that's like this very funky mix of like industry and nature. And so you can very much see like why certain plants thrive in this area. Or like if you go far enough down MacArthur, like you see like why are there more potholes here, like, you know, and just like kind of like thinking a lot about space and place, and then, you know, my relationship to that. That was a really long answer, but I'll pass it over to Destiny.
Yeah, no, thank you for that answer, because I feel, and also thank you for that question, because I feel like you answered another question that I had for you, which was more about like heirloom as a title, and yeah, and that journey. But I also really identified with what you were talking about in terms of just like deep listening to oral histories, and to like the familial oracular of like what people are saying about their lives and what questions they have about their own lives, and and what answers they can provide to the extent that they can. And I feel like Mother World also That was very much part of the process for many of the poems. There's like, there's a thread that names very explicitly ancestors, invokes very explicitly their stories. And that comes out of that deep listening from my parents, and my aunts and my grandparents, and like having that stir within me for a long time. Even if it just comes out as a fragment. So there's like this poem that it's like basically paying homage. It's like naming all of these caregivers, and it names my great grandfather Lim, who drove his truck through a KKK rally, and that stuck with me because I was at rallies where white supremacists were driving their trucks through our rallies, and so it like, and obviously it's not 1-to-1 ratio, right? But it made me really excited precisely because of anti-Black violence. I was like, wow, this is really, really great that I come from a man who drove his truck through a KKK rally in the 80s in Texas, you know? And so that's sometimes the way it comes out. But also like, kind of like on planes, I write a lot. And I don't know really why, but something about being in the sky, I end up writing a lot. And then sometimes it's just like there's a line and it just keeps strumming and strumming and strumming. And then I start building around that line. I do spend a lot of, I do think I spend more time in nature when I am in the process of writing something, but the writing doesn't necessarily take place outside. I might like write fragments and stuff, but like the poem making doesn't necessarily take place in that environment. But yeah, I also just kind of have a very incoherent writing process. I don't do the whole wake up. No, I don't do that. It's very incoherent. So
Thank you both for
Thank you.
sharing those responses. Yeah, it's always wonderful when people reaffirm. Yeah, you don't need to wake up 6 o'clock in the morning and write 1,000 pages or something. Yeah, that's not how it's done. Yeah, if anybody else has any other questions, just want to keep time in mind. But if not, I think awesome. Yeah, Sophia has a question. I'll just go aheid and read it. I'm enamored by the work of Alexis Pauline Gumbs and can't wait to dive deeper into y'all's work. Do y'all have any recommendations of writings of any multiple genres in Black ecology that personally impacted you? Awesome question, but yeah.
Yeah, a couple of ones that I can like off the top of my head. Maroon Choreography by Fahima Ife. This was a really cool work that I was just recently introduced to. And then I've also been reading, listen, you know, this one is a hard read. I think also because it has like pictures and stuff, but it's just like one of those books that'll like piss you off, but like, you know, you like need to know. African Ecomedia is really good. It's definitely like a lot more academic, but I think it really like does a really great trace of the impact of technology on ecosystems and on Blackness. And I mean, especially with the whole, you know, AI and like chat GTP, like, you know, like conversation like coming out, really just kind of thinking about like modes of Blackness and how that's kind of, and how they can like, or are trying to create like different ways while simultaneously poisoning people in the global South through that creation. And then another anthology that I really love is Ghost Fishing. It's an eco-justice anthology.
yeah, those are all great recs. So work that like I've spent a lot of time with, and I reference Toni Campbell-Barra a lot, but the Salt Eaters, like I think, I'm not sure that people always think of it as a Black ecological text, but it totally is. And that has impacted me in so many ways. From its like political incisiveness to like spiritually what it leaves. And that also like, there's like this panoramic view of a community in the face of an impending ecological disaster of a Black community. Someone else whose work I really love is Ashia Wadood, who's a poet. And so no knowledge is complete until it comes through my body, I think is the title. But that's a poetry manuscript that I think definitely engages Black ecological knowing. And then recently there's this book called This Will Not Be Generative. It's a short book. It's by, I believe they might pronounce the name as Dixa Ramirez de Oleo. And yeah, it's really heavy hitting. And it's a really great deconstruction and like critique of tendencies that appear in white feminist ecological writing that don't really account for / erase or just assume the continuation of anti-Black devastation.
Thank you for all of those really insightful texts. Definitely want to dive into those as well. That will be really awesome. So yeah, it's also always exciting to see the frameworks which people come from for creating creative work, like theory and creative work coming together in that way. So thank you. Well, thank you both for such a really insightful conversation, as well as hearing some really wonderful poetry earlier. The books are Mother World and Heirloom. We've been linking them in the chat, so definitely order those if you haven't read them yet. Get them at your library, get them from your local bookstore. But we are delighted that you all have been able to visit with us this evening. We also want to thank our ESL interpreters, Amber and Valina. Thank you for the work that you do with making sure our space is accessible. But yeah, thank you both so much. So excited to hear y'all's work. And thank you all for being here. Have a great rest of your evening.